The Shadow King of the North. They say he is a ghost, a name whispered in the back rooms of pubs, a rumor that drifts through the streets of Liverpool and Manchester. He has never been convicted of a serious crime. He has never spent a single night in a cell for the violence he is alleged to have orchestrated. His name is David Charles Hunt, and he is suspected of being one of the most powerful and most elusive crime bosses the United Kingdom has ever seen. This is not the story of a man behind bars. This is the story of the empire he built in the shadows, an empire of fear, money, and brutal control. An empire that, according to law enforcement and journalists, remains untouchable to this day. Before we delve into the dark and complex world of the Hunt Syndicate, make sure you are subscribed to Deduce. We uncover the stories that others can't, pulling back the curtain on the UK's most infamous criminals and unsolved cases. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single part of this investigation. To understand David Hunt, you must first understand the world that created him. He was born in 1960 in the heart of Liverpool, a city with a rich history and, at the time, a deeply entrenched criminal underworld. The post-war era in cities like Liverpool and Manchester was tough. Industries were declining, unemployment was high, and for many, opportunity was a scarce commodity. But where legitimate enterprise struggled, illicit trade flourished. This was the breeding ground for a new generation of criminals, smarter and more ambitious than their predecessors. Young David Hunt came of age in this environment. He wasn't from a notorious crime family, but he was sharp, observant, and possessed a ruthless ambition. His early years are shrouded in mystery, but the stories that have leaked out paint a picture of a young man learning his trade. He was a doorman, a bouncer at nightclubs. This was a classic entry point into the underworld. It was a position that offered more than just checking IDs. It was about control, intimidation, and understanding the flow of illicit money. It was on the door of a Liverpool nightclub that Hunt is said to have first crossed paths with the man who would become his mentor, and later, his rival, the infamous Curtis Warren. Warren at the time was building his own drug empire, a network that would eventually make him one of Britain's richest criminals. Hunt worked for Warren, learning the intricate logistics of international drug smuggling, the art of money laundering, and the absolute necessity of violence as a business tool. He was a quick study, but he was not content to be a mere lieutenant. Those who knew them then described a complex relationship. Hunt was fiercely ambitious, and Warren was a volatile and demanding leader. It was a partnership forged in the fires of the Liverpool underworld, but it was a partnership that would not last. The catalyst for the split was a massive police operation in the early 1990s. Curtis Warren and his associates were targeted in a sweeping investigation. Warren was eventually arrested and convicted, receiving a substantial prison sentence. His empire was left leaderless, vulnerable, and up for grabs. And David Hunt was waiting. This was his moment. While others in Warren's crew were arrested or scattered, Hunt saw an opportunity. He had observed Warren's methods, his successes, and, crucially, his failures. He saw how Warren's high profile had made him a target. Hunt decided he would do things differently. He would build an empire that was not reliant on a single flamboyant leader. He would operate from the shadows. He began to consolidate power, picking up the pieces of Warren's fractured network. But he didn't just reassemble it. He rebuilt it in his own image. He recruited strategically, bringing in trusted associates, family members, and hardened enforcers. This was the birth of what would become known as the Hunt Syndicate. Unlike the traditional hierarchical gang structures of the past, Hunt's organization was more like a corporation or a franchise. It was a network of semi-autonomous cells, each with its own specific function. One cell would handle drug importation from Europe. Another would manage distribution across the Northwest. Another would run protection rackets and illegal security at nightclubs. Another would focus on high-value fraud and money laundering. This structure was his first masterstroke. If one cell was compromised by the police, it could be severed from the rest of the organization with minimal damage. The people in the drug importation cell might not even know the identities of those running the prostitution rings. This limited the flow of information, protecting the man at the top. David Hunt insulated himself with layers of trusted lieutenants and legal buffers. He was never on the front lines. He was never the one holding the drugs, collecting the cash, or wielding the weapon. He was the strategist, the CEO of a criminal enterprise. But a CEO needs to project power, and in the underworld, power is projected through fear. Hunt understood this better than anyone. He cultivated an aura of menace that was as carefully constructed as his business model. Stories began to circulate, stories that may be apocryphal but served their purpose perfectly. It was said that he once made a rival gangster eat a pub glass ashtray. Another story tells of a man who crossed him, being tied to a chair and forced to watch as his business was burned to the ground. The message was clear. Cross David Hunt, and the consequences would be severe and terrifying. This reputation for calculated, extreme violence was his shield. It ensured loyalty, or at least compliance, from those within his organization and from rival gangs. He didn't need to be present at every act of brutality. His reputation did the work for him. People policed themselves out of fear of what he might do. By the mid-1990s, David Charles Hunt was no longer just a name from the Curtis Warren era. He was a power in his own right. The Hunt Syndicate was expanding, its tentacles reaching into Manchester, Leeds, and beyond. Its portfolio was diversifying. Drugs, of course, but also armed robbery, counterfeit currency, and a growing influence in the nighttime economy. He was amassing significant wealth, but unlike the flashy gangsters of film and television, Hunt lived relatively discreetly. He wasn't flaunting supercars or gold watches in public. The money was being filtered away, invested, and laundered through a web of legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses. He was becoming a phantom, a rumor with a real-world impact. The police knew he was a major player, but he was proving to be a frustratingly difficult target. He was careful, he was intelligent, and he had learned from the mistakes of those who came before him. He was building a fortress of anonymity and fear. And as his empire grew, so did the determination of the authorities to bring him down. But how do you catch a ghost? How do you build a case against a man who leaves no fingerprints on his own crimes? The answer, for the police, was to go undercover, to infiltrate the very heart of his organization. It would lead to one of the most ambitious and most controversial police operations in British history. An operation that would bring the authorities closer than ever before to the Shadow King of the North. An operation that would ultimately reveal just how deep his influence ran. The Phantom's Empire. The legend of David Hunt was growing. But a legend built on whispers and fear is not enough to sustain a criminal empire. It requires structure, logistics, and a business model more sophisticated than any legitimate corporation. Because for the Hunt Syndicate, every transaction carried the risk of imprisonment or a violent death. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Hunt's organization was no longer just a powerful gang. It was a multifaceted criminal conglomerate. Its operations were a masterclass in illicit enterprise, a dark mirror of globalized business. And at the core of it all was the lifeblood of the modern underworld: drugs. The syndicate's drug operations were its primary revenue stream, and they were run with chilling efficiency. They had established robust supply lines, particularly for cocaine and cannabis, from source countries in Europe and beyond. But Hunt had learned from Curtis Warren's downfall. Warren's mistake was being hands-on with the product. Hunt ensured there were multiple layers between him and the actual narcotics. The importation was handled by a dedicated cell, often using complex methods like hiding shipments in legitimate goods, frozen food, industrial machinery, even furniture. Once on UK soil, the distribution was managed by a separate, geographically distinct team. They used a network of safe houses that changed frequently and employed clean individuals with no police records as couriers. The money generated from this trade was astronomical. But cash is a problem. It is bulky, traceable, and useless in its raw form for buying assets or investing in a legitimate life. This is where the second pillar of Hunt's empire came into play: money laundering. The Hunt Syndicate became pioneers in cleaning dirty money. They invested heavily in the nighttime economy, acquiring bars, nightclubs, and pubs. These cash-rich businesses were perfect for mixing illegal profits with legitimate earnings. A club might take £10,000 at the door on a Saturday night, but could easily claim £15,000, with the extra £5,000 being dirty cash that was now clean. They moved into property development, a classic method for laundering large sums. They would set up complex chains of companies, often registered offshore, to purchase real estate. A payment for a renovation would be inflated, with the excess cash being paid to a shell company owned by the syndicate, effectively turning criminal profits into legitimate-looking business revenue. But the empire was not built on drugs and financial sleight of hand alone. Violence was the glue that held it all together, and the syndicate had a dedicated arm for enforcement. This was not mindless thuggery. It was corporate policy delivered with fists, knives, and guns. If a debt wasn't paid, the enforcers were sent. If a rival tried to move in on their territory, the enforcers were sent. If someone within the organization was suspected of talking, of skimming, or disloyalty, the enforcers were sent. The stories became more brutal, more chilling. It is alleged that the syndicate used torture techniques, that they had dedicated locations for carrying out punishments. They weren't just hurting people, they were sending a message, a grisly newsletter to the underworld about the cost of crossing David Hunt. His reputation for ruthlessness was his most valuable asset, a currency more powerful than the cash piling up in his hidden accounts. He was creating a climate of such intense fear that witnesses would refuse to testify, and victims would refuse to press charges. But the empire's reach extended even further into what is often called victimless crime, though the victims were very real. The syndicate was heavily involved in prostitution, controlling a network of brothels and escort agencies. They used coercion, debt, and intimidation to control the women involved, reaping huge profits from exploitation. They also ran sophisticated fraud operations, from high-value VAT scams to counterfeit goods. Every potential stream of illicit revenue was identified and analyzed and exploited. What made the Hunt Syndicate so unique and so difficult to combat was its corporate structure. Hunt was the chairman of the board. Below him was a small, tight-knit group of trusted directors, his inner circle, often including family members.
Below them were the middle managers, the lieutenants who ran the individual cells for drugs, money laundering, violence, and fraud. And at the bottom were the foot soldiers, the workers who often had no idea who they were ultimately working for. This structure was a fortress. A foot soldier arrested with a kilo of cocaine could only give up his direct handler. That handler might only be able to give up one of the lieutenants, and that lieutenant, no matter how much pressure the police applied, would likely never give up David Hunt. The risk was too great, the consequence too final. Hunt himself was living a life of calculated duality. In public, he was a successful businessman. He was a family man, seen at social functions, always well-dressed, always composed. He wasn't a flashy show-off. His power was displayed through his influence, not his possessions. He understood that the key to longevity was invisibility, to blend in, not to stand out. But the police were not idle. For years, various forces had been building intelligence on Hunt. They knew he was at the center of this web. They had snippets of conversations, financial anomalies, and the testimony of low-level players. But it was all circumstantial. They needed a breakthrough. They needed to get inside. And so, in the early 2000s, Merseyside police launched one of the most complex and dangerous undercover operations in British policing history. Its code name was Operation Sequel. The plan was audacious: to place an undercover police officer deep within Hunt's inner circle. The goal was to gather evidence of his direct involvement in orchestrating serious crimes. The chosen officer would have to live a lie for months, maybe years. He would have to gain the trust of some of the most paranoid and dangerous criminals in the country. The stakes could not be higher. For the officer, a single mistake, a single misplaced word would mean almost certain death. For the police, it was their best and perhaps only chance to catch the phantom. The stage was set for a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse was a king in his own castle, and the cat was living in the mouse's walls. The undercover officer was going in.
The man on the inside. The problem with a ghost is that you can't arrest a rumor. You can't handcuff a whisper. For the detectives on Merseyside, the name David Hunt was a constant, frustrating presence. They knew the scale of his operations. They saw the consequences of his syndicate's violence in hospital wards and on the streets. But Hunt himself remained untouchable, a silhouette behind a wall of associates and legal armor. To break through that wall, they needed a sledgehammer. That sledgehammer was an undercover operation of breathtaking audacity. Codenamed Operation Sequel, it was a high-stakes gamble that would take years to play out. The plan was simple in concept, but perilously complex in execution. Embed a highly trained undercover officer so deeply into Hunt's world that he could gather irrefutable, direct evidence of the crime boss giving orders. The officer chosen for this mission has never been publicly identified for his own safety. We will refer to him as only Vincent, a name that captures the gravity and the old-world grit of his task. Vincent was no rookie. He was an experienced undercover operative, a man who knew how to build a legend, a false identity so robust it could withstand the intense scrutiny of paranoid criminals. His backstory was meticulously crafted, his mannerisms perfected. He was inserted into the periphery of the Liverpool underworld as a wealthy, connected, and ambitious criminal from the South. His cover was that of a man looking to expand his operations north, a man with access to lucrative drug supplies and money laundering routes. For months, Vincent worked his way up the food chain. He made deals,
built trust, and carefully navigated the treacherous currents of the criminal ecosystem. Every meeting, every handshake, every conversation was a potential death sentence if his cover was blown. The goal was to get close to Hunt's inner circle, a group of fiercely loyal lieutenants and family members who acted as a human shield around their leader. This was the inner sanctum, and gaining entry was the ultimate test. The breakthrough came when Vincent managed to be introduced to a key figure in Hunt's organization. This was the first chink in the armor. Through a series of carefully orchestrated business transactions, selling them high-quality drugs at a good price, offering access to new money laundering channels, Vincent began to prove his value. He was not a rival, he was a resource. He was smart, reliable, and most importantly, he made the money. And in the underworld, money is the ultimate key that opens the most fortified doors. Slowly, carefully, he was granted access. He started attending meetings in anonymous hotel rooms and quiet pubs. He was introduced to more senior figures. The intelligence he began to send back to his handlers was a goldmine. He was providing a real-time blueprint of the Hunt Syndicate's operations. He learned about their drug importation routes from Spain and the Netherlands. He gathered details about their money laundering through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses, from car dealerships to property developments. He heard the whispers of violence, of punishments meted out to those who betrayed them or owed them money. But the ultimate prize, David Hunt himself, remained elusive. Hunt was a spectral presence, his name invoked with a mixture of respect and fear, but his physical person was rarely seen. Vincent had to be patient. He couldn't ask too many questions. He had to let them bring him closer, organically. Then it happened. After more than a year undercover, Vincent was invited to a meeting at a pub in the Greater Manchester area. This was not just any meeting with lieutenants. The word was that the man himself would be there. David Hunt was coming. The stakes for Vincent skyrocketed. This was the moment of maximum danger and maximum opportunity. Meeting Hunt face to face meant that he would be subjected to a level of scrutiny he had never experienced before. Hunt was known for his sharp intellect and his ability to read people. One wrong look, one hesitant answer, one tiny crack in Vincent's meticulously constructed facade, and it would all be over. The day of the meeting arrived. Tension would have been incredibly high, not just for Vincent, but for the entire police team monitoring the operation from a safe distance. Vincent was wired, his body transmitting audio back to his colleagues. His life was in their hands. David Hunt arrived. He was not what one might expect from a stereotypical crime boss. He was composed, quiet, and observant. He didn't need to shout or posture. His authority was implicit. The meeting began. Conversations flowed about business, about logistics, about problems that needed solving. And then, according to sources, it happened. David Hunt began to speak directly about his criminal enterprise. He discussed the specifics of drug shipments. He gave instructions on how money should be moved and cleaned. He talked about individuals who were causing problems and needed to be dealt with. For Vincent, sitting just feet away, this was the jackpot. Every word from Hunt's mouth was being captured, recorded, and beamed back to a recording device, building the case, brick by evidential brick. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't the testimony of a low-level criminal trying to cut a deal. This was the boss, the phantom, giving orders on tape. It was the moment the police had been working towards for years. Vincent continued in his role for some time after this landmark meeting, gathering more and more evidence. The intelligence he provided was so vast and so detailed that it allowed police to map the entire structure of the Hunt Syndicate. They now had names, dates, locations, and methods. They had the voice of the kingpin himself. Operation Sequel was, from an intelligence perspective, a stunning success. They had penetrated one of the most impenetrable criminal organizations in the UK. They had the man on tape. It seemed, after all these years, that the walls were finally closing in on David Charles Hunt. The ghost was about to be made flesh, arrested, and put on trial. But the story of David Hunt is never that straightforward. Having the evidence and making it stick in a court of law are two very different things. The Hunt Syndicate was about to show that its reach and its ruthlessness extended far beyond the streets of Liverpool.
The House of Cards. For the police, the success of Operation Sequel was like holding a winning lottery ticket. They had done the impossible. They had placed a man inside David Hunt's inner circle, and that man had captured the crime boss's voice on tape, seemingly directing his criminal empire. The evidence was damning. It felt like the end of a long and arduous journey. The phantom was finally within their grasp. The intelligence gathered by Vincent was so comprehensive that it allowed prosecutors to build a formidable case. They weren't just going for a minor conviction, they were preparing to charge David Hunt with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, conspiracy to commit armed robbery, and directing a criminal organization. These were charges that could put him away for decades, effectively ending his reign. The anticipation within Merseyside police was palpable. This was to be their landmark case, the one that would be studied for generations. It was the culmination of years of meticulous, dangerous work. The decision was made to move to the arrest phase. A date was set. The plan was coordinated with military precision. Simultaneous dawn raids were planned across the Northwest, targeting Hunt and his key lieutenants simultaneously, to prevent any of them from destroying evidence or fleeing. The goal was to decapitate the syndicate in one swift, decisive blow. On the morning of the raids, armed police units surrounded a series of properties. The most significant target was Hunt's own home, a large, well-secured property. The door was breached. Police swarmed in, and there they found David Charles Hunt. The man they had been hunting for over a decade was arrested in his own home. He was reportedly calm, composed, almost expecting them. He was taken into custody along with several of his top associates. The news sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The untouchable David Hunt was behind bars. For the first time, his invincibility seemed like a myth. He was processed, charged, and remanded into custody awaiting trial. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service were confident. They had the tapes. They had the undercover officer's testimony. They had financial records that corroborated the conversations. It looked to the outside world like a slam-dunk case. But inside the legal system, a storm was brewing. The defense team for David Hunt was formidable. They were some of the best and most expensive criminal lawyers in the country. Their strategy was not to prove Hunt's innocence, but to attack the prosecution's case with relentless, surgical precision. They filed a series of legal challenges, arguing that the evidence gathered by the undercover officer was inadmissible. They claimed entrapment, that the officer had not just observed crime, but had actively encouraged and participated in it, effectively manufacturing the evidence. This is a classic and often effective defense strategy in undercover operations. The defense began to pick apart every aspect of the case. They challenged the authorization of the undercover operation itself. They demanded to see the full, unedited logs of Vincent's activities, arguing that the context of the conversations was crucial. They filed motion after motion, creating a mountain of legal paperwork and procedural delays.
The pre-trial hearings became a battleground, a war of attrition fought in stuffy courtrooms rather than on the streets. The prosecution was forced onto the defensive, spending more time fighting legal technicalities than presenting the core of their evidence. But then something far more sinister began to happen. The climate of fear that David Hunt had cultivated for years started to seep into the judicial process. Witnesses who were due to testify began to get cold feet. Some received anonymous threats. Others were reminded, in not-so-subtle ways, of the consequences of cooperation. The reputation of the Hunt Syndicate for brutal retaliation was not just a rumor. It was a powerful tool that was now being deployed to protect its leader. Key individuals who were crucial to the money laundering and fraud aspects of the case suddenly became unavailable or changed their statements. The case, which had once seemed so solid, began to look like a house of cards, vulnerable to the slightest breeze. And then the breeze came. It became clear that the credibility of the undercover officer, Vincent, was going to be the central focus of the trial. The defense was prepared to subject his every action, every word, to microscopic scrutiny. They would paint him as an agent provocateur, a liar who had overstepped his legal boundaries. The psychological toll on Vincent, who had already sacrificed so much, would be immense. Faced with these overwhelming challenges, the legal delays, the intimidated witnesses, and the risk to their key officer, the Crown Prosecution Service was forced to make an agonizing decision. Just weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, they offered a deal. They would drop the most serious charges against David Hunt, including directing a criminal organization, if he would plead guilty to a lesser charge. It was a compromise, a stark admission that taking him down for everything was a risk they could no longer take. In a dramatic courtroom moment, the deal was accepted. David Charles Hunt, the man suspected of running a vast, violent empire, pleaded guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit armed robbery, relating to a plot to steal a shipment of cigarettes. The judge, acknowledging the seriousness of the offense, sentenced him to 6 years in prison. 6 years. For a man accused of so much more, it was merely a slap in the wrist. The police were devastated. Their years of work, the immense risk taken by their undercover officer, had resulted in a sentence that felt like a defeat. David Hunt was going to prison, but he was not being held accountable for the true scale of his crimes. The myth of the untouchable crime boss had not been shattered. It had been reinforced. He had beaten the system. The syndicate had weathered its biggest storm. And as Hunt was led away to begin his sentence, a new question emerged. What would happen to his empire while the king was temporarily dethroned? Would it crumble without its leader? Or was the Hunt Syndicate, like any good corporation, built to survive the absence of its CEO?
The Untouchable Legacy. David Hunt was in prison, but for the authorities, it was a hollow victory. The man they believed was a criminal mastermind, the architect of a vast and violent syndicate, had been convicted only of conspiring to steal cigarettes. He was sentenced to 6 years. For the detectives who had dedicated years of their lives to building a case against him, it felt like a failure of the system. The myth of David Hunt had not been broken. It had been cemented. He had faced the full might of British law enforcement and their most sophisticated undercover operation, and he had walked away with a sentence that felt more like a minor inconvenience than a real punishment. Inside prison, Hunt was treated with a level of caution and respect reserved for crime lords. His influence was still palpable. He was not a typical inmate causing trouble. He was a CEO temporarily working from a restricted office.
The real test was happening on the outside. What would become of the Hunt Syndicate, with its leader behind bars? Many criminal empires crumble when the head is removed. Power vacuums lead to internal wars. Rival gangs move in, and the structure collapses into chaos. But the Hunt Syndicate was different. It had been designed for this exact scenario. The corporate, cell-like structure that Hunt had meticulously built proved its resilience. The organization did not fracture. It adapted. His trusted inner circle, likely including family members, kept the machine running smoothly. The drug importation networks continued to function. The money laundering operations kept cleaning the profits. The enforcement arm maintained order and collected debts. The syndicate operated like a well-managed business with a temporarily absent director. It was a stark demonstration that Hunt's power did not come solely from his physical presence, but from the system he had created. A system built on fear, loyalty, and meticulous planning. After serving just over half of his 6-year sentence, David Hunt was released from prison in 2010. He was a free man. His conviction had done little to diminish his status in the underworld. If anything, it had enhanced it. He had taken the best shot the police had and had survived. He was now more of a legend than ever before. The police, of course, continued to watch him. But the landscape had changed. Hunt was older, wiser, and even more cautious. The experience of Operation Sequel had taught him valuable lessons about police methodology. He retreated further into the shadows. His public profile diminished almost to zero. He became a true phantom, his name rarely appearing in the press, his face unknown to the general public. But the intelligence reports suggested that his influence had not waned. It had evolved. The Hunt Syndicate was believed to have moved even deeper into the realm of high-level money laundering and international finance crime. These are crimes of paperwork and digital transfers, far removed from the violent streets. They are incredibly difficult to investigate and even harder to prosecute. The violence was still there, of course, but it was now a tool used only when absolutely necessary, deployed with even more precision. The syndicate was also suspected of expanding its operations globally, forming alliances with organized crime groups in Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. They were no longer just a UK problem. They were an international criminal enterprise. To this day, David Charles Hunt remains a free man. He has not been convicted of any serious crime since his release in 2010. He is believed to be living a life of immense wealth, protected by a wall of associates and lawyers, his name still spoken in hushed tones. So, why has he been so impossible to catch? The answer lies in the blueprint he created. He learned from the flamboyant mistakes of his predecessors. He built an organization that was structured to survive without him. He used fear as a strategic weapon. He insulated himself with layers of bureaucracy and legitimate business. He understood that in the modern world, the most powerful criminals are not those who wield the weapon, but those who control the money. The story of David Hunt is not a satisfying tale of justice served. It is a chilling lesson in the evolution of organized crime. It shows how a determined and intelligent individual can exploit the weaknesses in the legal system. It demonstrates that true power in the underworld is no longer about territorial control, but about influence, finance, and anonymity. He is the ghost that still haunts the UK's criminal landscape, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones you never see, the ones who can't be caught. If you found this deep dive into the shadowy world of David Hunt fascinating, make sure you've subscribed to Dark Deduce. We are dedicated to uncovering the truth behind the UK's most enigmatic and elusive criminals. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. We have many more stories of true crime, mystery, and the untold history of the underworld waiting for you. Thank you for watching.